I want you to imagine yourself prowling the valleys of Western Australia, a soldier, fighting to protect the land of your people. The enemy has been evasive, attacking innocent farmers rather than engaging with your troops. Despicable. You're deep in enemy territory now, hoping perhaps to catch the enemy unawares. If they won't engage with you, you'll have to bring the battle to them. After much time, you come upon an encampment. It seems the opposing army is gathering resources before the next assault. You stage an ambush, setting up your machine gun with the enemy perfectly centered on your reticle. It's time. You wait for the signal and pull the trigger. Fire! The gun's jammed. The enemy is quickly informed on your position and scatters into smaller groups, escaping the ambush unharmed. You head back to base after this unsuccessful mission and head to bed, praying to God that no more unsuspecting farmers are attacked as you slumber. As terrible as this seems, how surprised would you be if your enemies were not soldiers from a foreign region, but rather a flightless natural pest? And this battle is not part of some grandiose war, but rather a glorified political ploy that aimed to take advantage of those whose lives have been dominated by violence. Welcome, my friends. My name is Vincenzo Blake, and I'm here to present to you what I believe to be one of the most interesting events in recent history, the Great Emu War of 1932. Now, I know. I can hear you all now. A war against emus? What are you even talking about? I'm sure some of you are wondering what an emu even is. The Great Emu War of 1932 was an Australian military pest control operation attempting to reduce the number of the native flightless bird known as the emu. Now, that might have been a lot of information to take in, so I'll go through the basic story. Veterans of World War I were given land in Western Australia to farm after their service. Little did they know, however, that they were given land right smack in the middle of an emu migration path to the west. These emus, who were migrating in the hopes of finding food, came across the farmland and saw it as an all-you-can-eat buffet. They ravaged the crops, destroyed the fences, and rendered the farmland inarable with their urine. Before the farmers knew it, 20,000 emus had come upon their farmland and devoured most of their crops. They had no idea what to do, and frantically, in a last-ditch effort, they turned to the government who they had served for so long. But they weren't asking for just any sort of help. No, they wanted military power on their side. And for some strange reason, the government complied. They sent troops armed with Lewis machine guns to the farmland. They attacked the emus using advanced military gear for the time. And even stranger, the emus answered back in kind, evading fire and even having the largest bird among them keep watch as the others laid waste to the crops. In the end, the military operation proved severely unsuccessful. The Emu War drained too many resources and not nearly enough was gained from continuing it. You might think this is where our story ends. But no! Somehow, a singular loss was not enough for these farmers or the Australian military. It suffered not one, but two losses to the talons of his flightless bird, and at this point was vengeful, treating this as an actual war. Large-scale military vehicles with machine guns mounted on top were involved this time around, but the emus maneuvered around them easily. By now, I'm sure it's pretty apparent how unprepared the military is for birds running at 35 miles an hour. And yet, as unprepared as they were, the farmers once again asked for help. Yes, you heard me. They asked again. You know what they say, right? Fool me once, shame on me. Fool me twice, shame on you. Fool me thrice, and I'm an Australian farmer. Fortunately, the government declined their request, and they declined again. And again? And again? In 1934, 43, and 48, the Australian farmers called upon the military for aid. Yes, they even went as far as to suggest that we use bombs on the birds. Bombs! But nothing ever came of that request. Nowadays, emus are protected under Australian federal law, and they can migrate in peace. Though, now they are allies. The Australian people will not soon forget the time they got humiliated by emus. So that's the story. Funny, right? The Australian farmers initiating war on emus. But what if I told you there was something deeper? For many, I'm sure, it was easy to write this off as another odd twist in the novel that is human history. But me? No, I couldn't just accept that. This event has to be one of the most interesting psychological phenomena in history. And most people would look at this and argue that it's just another instance of Australia's signature over-the-top pest control. For those who don't know, Australia has a history with trying to cull animals like cats or bunnies due to their effect on agriculture and the ecosystem. But the reality is, Australia has never treated any other pest in such an unruly manner before or after the Emu War. Take the non-native rabbits of Australia, for example. These rabbits were introduced from boat travel and have been a nuisance to both the people and animals of Australia ever since. Australia has been trying to reduce the rural population since the early 1900s, and just beyond being pests to farmers, they negatively affect Australia's environment as a whole. But did Australia have a bunny war? No, of course not. They built a wall and put up bounties so that real hunters with extensive knowledge on hunting animals could get the job done. So you see, even when animals have done far more damage than that of the emu, they have never been battled in the same way that the emus were. So why? Why would it happen this way? Farmers asking for military weapon use against birds. Governments complying at each request until they physically were unable to because the resources were exhausted. Australia treating a natural pest with more disdain than they've ever treated any other pest throughout history. How did we get here? What events led to this moment? What happened to start the Great Emu War of 1932? That's the question I set out to solve. And it wasn't a question that always seemed very easy to solve. The Emu War, as niche as it is a very hard topic to find good information on. If you were to look at the Wikipedia page right now, you'd be told the same story as I just told you. A tale of a battle between a military fresh out of World War I getting humiliated by the likes of birds. But after much research, I think I've come to a conclusion. And what a conclusion it is. Bad faith actors behind the scenes, trying tales of war and sadness. People feeling rejected by a government that promised to protect them. A new character pulling the strings of conflict for their own gains. So sit tight, my audience, as I tell you the untold story of the Great Emu War. And maybe, just maybe, by the end of this song, you might start to recognize a familiar tune. Before we begin our story, let us start with establishing our characters and parties. First, we have the farmers, a group of World War I veterans given land in Western Australia to farm. What immediately became interesting about this party is their military history. World War I is a tragic time for everyone involved, and you can understand how war might have affected these farmers at the time. As shown by many verifiable sources and studies, war has a large negative impact on mental health. Sources like the University of San Francisco claim that while the effects of war seem to vary from person to person, it is undeniable that those who fight in war suffer a serious mental decline. It's not a stretch to think that this mental decline, especially from being around violence, could make these farmers more prone to, well, violence. Especially when I learned of the specific request from the farmers for Lewis machine guns. I'm sure most of you people don't know what a Lewis machine gun even is, so I'll go ahead and break down what a monstrous killing machine this Lewis machine gun is. The Lewis machine gun, a gas-operated light machine gun invented in 1914, primarily used in World War I by Allied forces. Firing 500 rounds a minute, up to 880 yards, this was the weapon of choice for many Australian military units at the time. Its lightness and ease of use made it versatile to many situations, whether it be grounded combat or aerial assault. I suspect these veterans, when faced with another conflict, turned to the military weapons and tactics they've always known. To them, a powerful killing machine like the Lewis machine gun, for which they themselves can vouch for its effectiveness, was sure to be a perfect weapon for fighting their favored foe. But of course, it was not the farmers themselves who fired the shots, as all they could do was plead and cry until the military got involved. More specifically, Major Meredith, the one who led the war against the emus. As much as I tried to dig, there was very little information found on this guy. It's as if he was plucked from the void of obscurity itself. But know this, he was a very vengeful person, who even after losing the first time to the emus, adamantly advocated to get redeployed. He didn't take losing very well, and after every negative encounter with the emus, his mood significantly worsened. But make no mistake, part of the reason the Second Emu War occurred was because of Major Meredith's insatiable need for revenge against the bird. But of course, we can't forget the emus themselves, migrating across Western Australia, looking for food and water, 20,000 of them, mind you. Looking at how emus are viewed by the wider Australian public, they are immensely respected. They even made it on the Australian coat of arms, along with the kangaroo. So, why would anyone support a war against them? Well, allow me to introduce you to the idea known as the baby schema. Studies suggest that animals that exhibit more childlike features, like big eyes or a round head, are more likely to be seen as cute. It makes sense. Humans by nature are very selfish creatures, and we're always relating things back to ourselves. And emus, of course, are the very antithesis of childlike. They're 5 foot tall with large beaks and talons. They make noises that sound like the low rumbles of a video game controller. Under the concept of the baby schema, these birds are not only uncute, but blatantly ugly. This was probably a good justification to the public when it was announced that the government was going to be allocating resources for an emu war. It's hard to feel bad for something you can't empathize with, and nothing is harder to empathize with than a 5 foot tall, feathered pest. But right now, all we have are little bits and pieces of information, perhaps enough to make some interesting points, but not nearly enough to make a story. So I kept searching. There had to be a reason this event took place. It couldn't just boil down to farmers with PTSD and a military leader with anger issues. But then I saw it. As I researched, the person kept popping back up into the spotlight. At first I thought they had a minor role, hardly worth mentioning. But as time went on and he kept coming up, I realized that he was the thread that connected this whole story together. He himself was the reason this story began in the first place. A new actor has entered on stage. Let me introduce you to him. Sir George Foster Pearce, Senator for Western Australia, a progressive politician who's been involved in Australia's politics from the beginning of the 1900s. He was involved in the creation and establishment of the Australian Labour Party, and at this point has been working in politics for the better part of 3 decades. But more importantly, he was the man that signed off on everything to do with the Emu War. The guns, the troops, all of it. On first appearance, I thought he was like the rest, still living in times of war, looking for something to shoot a gun at. But as I read, I realized the truth was actually much more grim. So let me tell you the story from the top. Here it is. Everything. The heroes, the villains, and the victims. After World War I, the Australian government had a bunch of veterans who seemed now to live purposeless lives. To alleviate this issue, they gave these veterans the land in Western Australia to farm. The veterans took this opportunity, as broken as they were from the war. They wanted to try out a new life and move on from there. They had made a small farming town called Wogalan and worked to make that land suitable for farming. But of course, it could never be that simple. The land that the veterans got was extremely poor for farming. The government, who these men had served for so long, had essentially sold them a dream that led them to poverty. And that poverty was only exacerbated further by the Great Depression that hit them in the 1920s. Now, with little to no crops, and no way to make a profit from selling them, the farmers of Western Australia cried out, begging for help from the government. But the Australian government didn't listen. They demanded that the farmers sell what little crops they had at a loss. The Australian government turned its back on their own veterans, leaving them to die in poverty. But the farmers wouldn't have it. They retaliated by refusing to sell their crops, hurting Australia's economy further. As tensions rose between Western Australia and their government, talk of secession was the first thing on everyone's mind. Western Australia wanted to separate from the government, but left them suffering in this wasteland. Maybe if they were self-governed and they could make their own rules, they could finally pursue the peaceful farming life they've always dreamed of. And maybe something might have come of this movement, if it wasn't for the fact that they got sidetracked by a feathered foe. Yes, here we are. The emus are finally getting involved. As I've previously explained, the farmland given to the farmers was found by a group of 20,000 emus heading west for migration. They found this farmland, rich in resources and food, and proceeded to devour the crops, breaking the fences and urinating everywhere, rendering much of the farmland useless. I can imagine how these farmers felt, having fallen on tough times already from the Depression, and now 20,000 5-foot-tall birds are annihilating what little they have left. Perhaps that feeling of emptiness and pain took them back to a different time, a time of battle and conflict, a time of war. And just like then, the solution remained the same. There was only one thing they could do: call upon the power of the Australian military. Now, my friends, this is where the man I've been building up from the beginning enters the picture. George Foster Pearce, Secretary of Defense and Senator for Western Australia. Because of his political position, he has a vested interest in keeping Western Australia from leaving Australia as a whole. With that being said, he is equally unwilling to actually spend a hefty amount of resources to restore the heavily agricultural West. He knows that with the way things stand now, he has no chance of winning the next federal election. Western Australia as a whole has been adamant about leaving Australia. But George Pearce, however, has made it public that he thinks there is more benefits in maintaining unity. Because of his political situation, he knows Western Australia will obviously vote for a pro-secession senator, and he'll be out of office. So, when he received the call from the farmers of Western Australia, still reeling from the emu onslaught, instead of looking into an effective way to keep the emus out, perhaps hire hunters to kill them, he saw this as an opportunity to win the hearts and minds of the Western Australian people. He wanted to flex the power of the Australian government, to show Western Australia that they shouldn't leave, that Australia as a whole did care about them, and of course to firmly place the blame, the farmers' financial struggles, on the emu rather than on poor government policy. So he devised a plan. He chose to send military troops over to Western Australia to fight the emus. He dubbed this a war of its own, the Great Emu War of 1932, to make it seem grandiose and important. He wished to market this as the moment in which Australia would stand up to his biggest threat, the moment in which Western Australia would be saved, and of course, the moment that would mark the fall of the natural pest known as the emu. He even hired a cameraman to film as the troops did their thing, hoping for good publicity. As for his weapon of choice, despite the fact that a hunter would use rifles to kill these animals, George Pearce asked for Lewis machine guns to be the main weapon of choice, courtesy of the farmer's request. He knew that these weapons were used extensively in World War I, and using them would ease the mind of the farmers and help his own political image. It also felt rather obvious that these advanced military weapons that won a war spanning continents would be equally, if not more effective against a flock of wild birds. In some ways, George Pearce thought it was overkill, and the use of this weapon would have the job done in days. Oh, how naive he truly was. But put that aside for now. George Pearce has chosen the method and the weapon of choice. All he needs now was a leader who would lead this attack against the emus. In the interest of not trying to make this joke of a war and tying it to anyone super decorated or important, George Pearce picked a perfectly obscure individual, Major Meredith, a man who, in present day, is now only known for his actions in the Great Emu War. So, with everything set, it was time for the Emu War to commence. As we've established, these first few attempts at killing the emus were hardly noteworthy. If you remember that anecdote from the introduction, that was a real event that happened in an engagement with the emus. Meredith had planned an ambush on the group of emus drinking from a watering hole. But as they were about to fire, the machine guns jammed, and a majority of emus escaped. And things weren't much better from there. Since then, the emus reportedly had been using the tallest bird of the bunch to keep watch as the others ate. Victory only seemed more elusive as time went on. Eventually, the last of the crops were either moved or eaten, and the land worthless, cementing the emus as the victor in this war. So, why did this happen? It seemed as if defeat would be impossible. The Australian military using military-grade weapons against emus? How exactly did these flightless foes pull it off? Well, for one thing, there was 20,000 of them. 20,000 of anything is going to be a formidable opponent, whether it's cockroaches or demigods. But beyond just the numbers advantage, the emus had tactics and features that made them harder to kill than a common creature. Emus have thick skin that allowed them to take multiple bullets before dying. This was helpful in surviving attacks in the war, but also inflated the reported numbers of emus surviving each engagement, when in reality the emus were dying of bleeding after the fact. leading the public perception that the military's efforts were ineffective, which they were, but not to the extent that was originally reported. Emus can also run as fast as 30 miles per hour, making them a hard target to hit. They would run circles around the military vehicles, and were much more adapted to the rough terrain of Western Australia. But it wasn't just the emu's excellence that led them to victory, but also the Australians' incompetence. Little did George Pearce know at the time, but his selection of Lewis machine guns was a poor choice for killing wildlife. Though, throughout much of human history, rifles, shotguns, blowguns, and even boomerangs have been used to kill animals. But hardly will you ever see a machine gun being the weapon of choice for any modern hunter. This is no doubt part of the reason why the Emu War was so unsuccessful. Despite the very apparent power that the Lewis machine gun held, it was a rather ineffective tool for culling the emu population. So, the first Emu War was a major failure, on all fronts. Most of the food was not saved, and the number of emus killed pales in comparison to how many they had left. One would think that after such a devastating performance it would be over. But if it were that simple, we wouldn't be telling this story in the first place, now would we? The fact of the matter is the emus came back once again, and they came back once again, of course, in large numbers. The farmers, once again, begged for assistance, and despite the first attempt being so unsuccessful, they saw it as the only solution. And they weren't the only ones. Major Meredith also requested to be redeployed onto the battlefield. His contact with the emus had changed him. Famously, he said, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world. They can face machine guns with the invulnerability of tanks." Major Meredith knew what he was facing now, and was looking for revenge. So once again, these cries for help, aid, and redemption were brought to George Pearce's desk. What was he to do? Publicity-wise, while the farmers themselves appreciated the effort, on a wider scale, it was looked on very negatively. During the war, George Pearce was asked how he could justify killing birds with military-grade machine guns under any definition of morality. He claimed that using machine guns were just as moral as any other weapon, as long as the job got done. And it wasn't just Australia. Word of this war spread as far as England. People also shared this negative perspective, claiming that it was the destruction of a native bird. The press painted George Pearce as a joke. He was a clown. He couldn't even successfully defeat a bird. So George Pearce had two options: resign himself to defeat and aid the farmers using better methods that weren't as beneficial to his political image, or take a chance, become the hero of Western Australia, and prove to the world that he had what it takes to kill these 5-foot feathered pests. And George Pearce, he took the gamble. To save his political career, George Pearce once again declared the beginning of the Second Emu War. So Major Meredith and his men were ready to strike again with vengeance. The numbers were looking better this time, too. The crops were getting saved. Was this the second win they needed? Was victory truly in their grasp? Would man finally win the Great Emu War of 1932? They did! Mission accomplished. He came back declaring it was a massive success. Nearly 3,500 emus slaughtered, a battle well fought. So that was it. George Pearce won. The battle he orchestrated was a success. Western Australia, after seeing his efforts and subsequent victory, would surely stay part of the country. And of course, he would be re-elected as senator and make more money. And for a small period of time, it seemed like that was going to be the case. The farmers could finally go back to providing for their families. George Pearce could go back to doing his everyday senatorial duties. And the emus could come back to ravage the crops. Wait, what? Yes, as if it was inevitable. They came back again, relentlessly destroying the hard work of the farmers. But of course, the farmers knew the drill. They once again called upon the military to provide them aid. But this time the government's answer was a resounding no. The resource drain from the Great Emu War was too costly. And if the government hates one thing, it's cost. The farmers got desperate. They began asking again and again and again and again, even suggesting that instead of ground engagement, perhaps it was time for bombs and an airstrike, for which the government refused again. Like it was just like the beginning. The government turned their backs on these Western Australia farmers. Eventually, it was no longer sustainable to farm in these areas, and little by little, the farmers of a farm town such as Walgalan eventually left, leaving the dreams, hopes, and futures that the government sold them never looking back. Suffice to say that George Pierce may have claimed to win the Emu battle, but never did he understand the scope or severity of the Emu War. Speaking of which, what happened to George Pierce? A man willing to slay thousands of birds in order to keep his spot as Senator for Australia. But unfortunately for him, he made a gamble and he lost. In future years, the absurdity of his actions were clear to the public. He was made fun of by his political opponents and the media alike, and he became known as the Emu War guy, even though he never brought it up in future conversation. In the end, his political ploy to keep the Western Australians from seceding failed. Western Australia attempted to leave, but fortunately, the British made them stay, saying that secession was illegal. George Pierce, of course, did not win the re-election he was fighting for, and was kicked out of a job after the next federal election. This man, who was willing to sacrifice everything, the lives of the native birds, the livelihood of the people he represented, even his own dignity, for a naked political power, and yet he still failed. While you could say his ability to fight the birds, his choice of weapon, his lack of knowledge, and his own incompetence caused him to fail, I would say that he lost from the very beginning, the very moment he decided to wage war against birds, because no matter how he spent it, no matter what he did to make it seem heroic and necessary, people would look back on what he did. They would laugh. This man was no longer a politician. He was a clown. And while they are quite funny, unfortunately, clowns don't win any sort of election, and they don't win any sort of wars. With all that being said, what's the takeaway here? We've established already that the Great Emu War was not a war at all, but rather a publicity stunt. George Pierce attempted to take advantage of the farmers of Western Australia, using their past traumatic experiences as a means to manipulate them. That's why he approved of military support. That's why he hired a cameraman. That's why he requested for the very same guns those farmers used all those years ago. George Pierce may have failed spectacularly, and you and I can look at what he did and laugh at him, but I ask you this. How many political figures, people of influence and power, have spun lies and fabricated stories to indoctrinate us into their belief systems? Politicians prey on your fears and doubts to exploit them and use them for your votes. What if the immigrants are taking your jobs? What if the election was rigged? What if global warming is a hoax? What if the emus are actually threatening your livelihood? Then they capitalize on that fear, but with false promises, claiming that their solution will fix all your problems. All you have to do, however, is vote for them. The Emu War displays the power of propaganda. And while it may have been an amusing example, I hope that it helps us recognize the power that storytelling has in the manipulation of our lives. Thank you.